Reconstructing philosophy. Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Reconstructing Philosophy podcast. I'm Matt Silk, and I'm back, and I have a returning guest. So he is an expert on William Clifford, and he recently co-authored a book entitled An Inquirer's Guide to Ethics in AI. I've read it. It's quite good. So my guest today, is Dr. Ian MacDonald. And some people might, question me. Oh, you're on episode 8 and you already have a returning guest. Well, let me tell you, he's back to respond to some of the important questions that we had last time and to help fill in some of the gaps. And to see what some of the next steps of his research are.
So back off! Sorry about that.
So, yes, my guest is Dr. Ian MacDonald. Ian, thanks for being here.
It's great to be here, Matt, especially this time in person. When we had our first podcast, it was during the pandemic, and that put a strain on things too, so this time I found it to be more pleasant and nice to be here with you, chatting about philosophy, and Clifford, one of those figures that I continue to research, so
yeah,
great to be here.
It's true. It started very much as a sort of lockdown thing, and yeah, it's great to talk to people in person for a change. Yeah. So Ian is an expert on William Kingdon Clifford and his work, The Ethics of Belief. So Ian, maybe to start with, and to reacquaint some of our listeners with the Clifford's work, can you just explain in brief detail Clifford's evidentialist principle and what the ethics of belief is all about?
Sure. Clifford was a brilliant mathematician from the Victorian period. So he was living in the 1800s. And one of the things that they were encountering then was this Victorian crisis of faith. So there was a question going on about the nature and evidence for miracles, for example, and whether we should believe them. Now, the crisis of faith was sparked because of people like Charles Darwin, for example, who came out with On the Origin of the Species and The Descent of Man, and other works that were arguing for human evolution. And that, of course, challenged traditional creationist stories, our place in the universe, our place in nature. And it was really starting to weigh on people who were religious-minded and religious authorities, and thinking maybe they would lose some of that authority if these views were true. So there was this crisis going on, and if you want to understand Clifford's evidentialism and the ethics of belief, you have to understand it within this context. And so Clifford originally gave the ethics of belief as a lecture to the Metaphysical Society. That was the most eminent, foremost Victorian debating club, right? It had prime ministers in it, it had Nobel laureates. It was, the who's who of Victorian England in this club, and they would continually debate this question about miracles, especially the miracle of the resurrection, right, of Jesus of Nazareth, but also other Christian miracles, because many of them were Christians. And so Clifford had weighed in on this with his ethics of belief, and there's some scarcely concealed criticisms of Christianity and other religions in this work. But one of the pieces that really needs to be spoken of is Thomas Henry Huxley's The Evidence of the Miracle of the Resurrection. And this was about, again, Jesus of Nazareth, and whether Jesus indeed died on the cross, was put into an empty tomb, and then rose again, right? And we have this, of course, in our Easter story. And so Huxley argued, and this was the most notorious presentation at the Metaphysical Society, that Jesus didn't die on the cross in the way that you or I would think of death as the permanent end of one's life. Rather, he swooned. The swoon theory is that he passed out when unconscious, but lost all these vital signs, bodily signs of living, but his body was still capable of revival. And this happens, Huxley says, in a variety of cases. Even you looked at wounded soldiers on the battlefield. Sometimes they'll lose all signs of life, but they'll be able to recover. The other cases, these ones of Indian fakirs or gurus who bury themselves alive for 3 days, and then they're unearthed, and they seem like they're dead, right? And that they lose all these sort of vital signs. But then, you warm them up, you give them a bit of water and whatever else, and they are able to revive. The other one, of course, is like shrimp brine. If you've ever seen sea monkeys and the sort of playful phenomenon that children love, where, these are dried up shrimp that you then immerse again in water, and they seemingly come back to life. Well, Huxley had thought, well, if you have these kind of cases, right, do you have evidence that Jesus had this miraculous resurrection, or did he simply have what Huxley called a somatic death? Now, somatic death is just the loss of vital signs, but it's consistent with revival. And Huxley said, the witnesses at what was this event on the cross, and even the empty tomb, would not have known about these cases of somatic death. They weren't physiologists. They weren't trained as doctors. And so they might have thought, for all that they saw, that this was a miracle. But Huxley then started questioning the evidence. He said that there's these real doubts and questions that are left over. And he actually says that, daily we're assigning more responsibility to the momentous words, "I believe." And so Clifford was in the audience. He was the youngest member of the society, and it must have just piqued his mind. And so 3 months later, he delivers this lecture, The Ethics of Belief, to that same society. And according to Brown, who's this historian, said that it caused a kind of storm of controversy among the religious-minded, right, who were just already very upset with what Huxley had said in his presentation. And then to have Clifford do this and say, no, we've got to consider the evidence again, and inquire and investigate into the evidence. And this is what sort of launches this ethics of belief. And so when we talk about Clifford's evidentialism, many people in the literature will say, well, it's the view that you need evidence, and sufficient evidence or adequate evidence, to warrant a belief, right? Unless you have that evidence, you shouldn't believe. You should maybe withhold belief or do something else, right? Now, Clifford gives these different cases to motivate his view. One of them is the shipowner case. We talked about that in the first episode, right? A shipowner goes down to the dock. He sees that the ship is weather-beaten. There might be cracks in the hull or mast. There's problems with it. He knows that it wasn't well built to begin with, and that it looks like it's not seaworthy. Now, these doubts are eating away at him, right? They really alert him. The alarm bells are ringing in his mind. But he knows that the ship is supposed to take these travelers on a long voyage to the New World, and he thinks, okay, the ship has succeeded before, right? It will probably succeed again, and maybe then God's providence, God's goodness will be watching over these people and take care of it. Now, notice that if it's God's providence that's supposed to do the work, it takes it out of human hands, right? Whereas Clifford thought, no. The ship owner has a duty to look at that evidence and see whether or not it rules out his doubts. And Clifford says, no, what the ship owner did was he stifled, suppressed, smothered those doubts. We would even say drowned them out, right? And that, if the ship owner engages in that kind of thing, in a refusal to investigate the evidence further, Clifford thinks that he's done something wrong because he didn't have evidence that would have been enough to rule out these doubts. His evidence was insufficient, in this case, for belief. And Clifford says, well, okay, he's blameworthy then, at least for this belief, right, that he's formed, and also, not investigating the evidence further. Now, the other cases of these agitators, and they're a group that accuses another group of brainwashing and kidnapping children, and they just make this claim because they want to destroy the reputation of these islanders. But they avoid investigation. They have very scant evidence for it. And Clifford thinks again, the thing to really clue in on is whether or not they earned that belief through fair inquiry and founded it on good evidence. And if we want to clarify what good evidence means, it means evidence that does rule out these doubts or questions. So Clifford makes this kind of epic statement, right? That it is wrong always, everywhere, and for anyone to believe anything upon insufficient evidence. And there's a real controversy in the literature about what he means by sufficient evidence or insufficient evidence even. Now, I will alert you without rambling on that there's one passage here that clarifies this quite nicely, and it ties it into inquiry. And I'm looking at Clifford as primarily an inquirer. And so what Clifford says, in the two supposed cases, that is the shipowner and agitators, which have been considered, it has been judged wrong to believe on insufficient evidence, or to nourish belief by suppressing doubts and avoiding investigation. The shipowner suppresses doubts, stifles them. The agitators avoid investigation. This gives us a clue as to what Clifford means by this duty of inquiry, which is the name of this first section of the Ethics of Belief.
So that was a very helpful recap of Clifford's views, and I know since our last episode, you were already working on Clifford's work back then, and you've already done a number of additional bits of research on Clifford. I know you've published papers, you've gone to several conferences. So I was wondering if you might just be able to outline what your own work on Clifford entails and what you're interested in terms of getting out of Clifford's work.
So it picks up on what I just left off with, which is looking at Clifford primarily as an inquirer and his duty of inquiry being something that captures the core argument in the ethics of belief. Because oftentimes he's looked at through this evidentialist lens. And there's this question about like sufficient evidence and what would count as sufficient evidence. Now there I think there's an assumption, right? That if you were to meet whatever Clifford's duty of inquiry is, then it would give you the kind of warrant you need for belief. However, what Clifford is really concentrating on is why it is wrong to believe on insufficient evidence, right? And the reason for that is this duty of inquiry is a guardrail. And it's trying to prevent a slide towards what he calls credulity, becoming credulous. This is the real worry at the heart of Clifford's ethics of belief. And I'll try to explain to you why, and it relates to the kind of work I'm doing, because I'm trying to reconstruct this argument in a way that clarifies why Clifford would have such an insistent, staunch view, right? And say it's always wrong and for everyone anywhere, and, the kind of absolutist character of that. Now, if we ask, okay, what do we need as sufficient evidence for a belief? I'm not sure Clifford would see that as the right way of looking at things, and the reason for that is because he has this duty of inquiry, and he thinks that inquiry is a kind of key to this. That every time you have evidence for something, you have to wonder whether that evidence would rule out doubts, questions you have, whether or not it would answer the sort of tests you might propose for it, right? The reason, again, is if someone says to you, hey, Matt, this person died and they came back to life, right? And there was a miracle going on. And you'd say, well, does that really rule out this claim about somatic death, right? And if it doesn't, and say the person was only on the cross for 3 to 6 hours and then, was like this person who could come back to life even after 3 days, then you have this possibility there that gives you an alternative explanation for the phenomenon. And if those doubts stand and they stand as reasonable doubts, then it looks like our evidence doesn't rule them out, and we have this duty to inquire and to carry on investigation. Now, for Clifford, this is hugely important, because if we believe something when there are still remaining questions or doubts that we have, and ones that are the kind of core ingredients for inquirers, right? That you and I, when we think about inquiry, we're usually thinking about doubts, a problematic situation, right? As Dewey might put it, something that really is still burning within our minds and that we haven't been able to satisfy. Well, Clifford would say, look, you can't believe in those cases because if you do, you're doing something you shouldn't. This starts to tap into the nature of belief. And it's the point I want to get to, because a lot of people say, oh, what Clifford's up to in the ethics of belief is he's trying to give this ethics which looks at beliefs and their ties to actions, right? That a belief and an action can never be severed. And Clifford does say this, but it's not the entire account. It's not even primarily the most important point. Now let's try to consider this from the view about the nature of beliefs. If you ask someone what is a belief, sometimes they'll have some trouble answering it, right? But they might think it's just something you entertain in your mind. Some people might think that, right? Clifford didn't. I don't think you do. And I don't know about our listeners, but many probably have thoughts about this, right? If you turn to, say, an epistemologist who's someone who studies the theory of knowledge, in epistemology they give this really minimal conception of belief, which is to take something to be true. So if I believe that there's a computer before me, I take it to be true that there's a computer before me. Very, very simple. Now, Clifford's more akin or aligned with classical pragmatists, right? And thinking that beliefs are tied to action. So a belief will make us apt or ready to act on it, right? And if we think about that ship owner, if that ship owner has somehow stifled those doubts and over time, across time, has then come to this belief, then he's ready to let that ship launch. Not only that, because he believes this, he's willing to do something similar in similar circumstances, the same types of scenarios, right? So a belief's just not a one-off, it's rather, it gives you this kind of habit of conduct, a tendency. But again, this last point about belief is very, very important, which is not so much about action, but that when you believe something, you shut down your mind about it to some extent, right? You've made up your mind about whatever it is you believe. And therefore, and Clifford doesn't have this kind of vocabulary or verbal repertoire, but you have confirmation biases, a perseverance of opinion, right? You're going to look for evidence that confirms your existing belief. And then he thinks you cannot fairly investigate it. You cannot meet this duty of inquiry. And that's why it's always wrong to believe in something upon insufficient evidence when there are leftover doubts, leftover questions, more investigating to do, is because now you've shut down your thinking about it. And once you've done that, it could be really hard to return to that original state. And so that's where the sort of ethics of belief comes into it, because you start to slide towards credulity. And Clifford thinks if you're willing to shut down your mind on certain things and say to believe in even, a miracle, which is an extraordinary example, right? What else are you going to be willing to believe in? And haven't you started to diminish our standards of inquiry? And that's why it's inquiry-centered once again.
So, obviously the idea of credulity and forming guardrails against credulity is really important. And it's interesting because the idea of credulity is becoming more and more of a potential concern given the rise of any beliefs that we might form on the basis of artificial intelligence. So can you just explain a little bit more what credulity means, why Clifford was so concerned about this slide into credulity, and what a over-credulous world might look like today?
Certainly. So by credulity, Clifford means a kind of habitual openness towards believing things for what he calls unworthy reasons. Things that, the evidence, again, doesn't eliminate those questions or doubts we might have. But it also makes us almost naive and gullible, right? And ready to believe things that are self-serving. Part of the duty of inquiry is that there's this strong social basis there to believe things properly, and especially to follow this duty of inquiry. So credulity is one of Clifford's grave worries because of the impact that beliefs that are badly or irresponsibly formed have on all of us in society, but he's also thinking of successive generations. He talks about humanity at times, and worries that, again, by believing things prematurely or rashly, by avoiding the duty of inquiry or suppressing our doubts, that we end up, again, diminishing these standards and becoming more or less credulous in our thinking, and then we're open to really kind of bad reasoning, to uncritical thinking. And that, of course, matters, especially in this age of AI, because I think we have to be on guard for many of the things that, AI contributes to negatively when it comes to, say, echo chambers, confirmation bias, perseverance of opinion, misinformation, disinformation. All of these really worrisome things that can get us to believe for bad reasons. And again, once we form a belief, we shut down our thinking about it to some extent, and it's difficult to return to an unbiased state. Clifford mentions this explicitly, and so that makes it really important that we uphold this standard of reasonable belief and a duty of inquiry, especially now that we're in this age of AI.
So, in line with that theme on credulity and AI, because, and maybe this ties together a few questions, so it'll be, bear with me while I unpack this a little bit. So one of the interesting things about Clifford's argument is he makes this point about how it's about how the belief is formed, not necessarily what the belief is, and if it turns out to be right or wrong, but whether you obtained it in the right way, which already sounds a lot like a deontological argument rather than a consequentialist argument about how belief should be formed and the ethics relating to those kinds of issues. But a lot of what Clifford is talking about when he's talking about the idea of credulity is he seems to be on guard again about this idea of future generations and what might happen to them. So does his argument about credulity, is that more of an argument about basically an argument against the idea of stifling doubts rather than the idea of having sufficient evidence for claims? So that's one part of my question. And the other part of my question is whether there might be some circumstances where we might say that perhaps we might license a little bit of credulity for the sake of additional benefits that might accrue, right? So Clifford is obviously very much concerned about these epistemic concerns. But AI, for example, offers a lot of promise of efficiency and cheaper costs and the ability to work at scale. And, there are a lot of potential benefits to that, even if there might be questions about whether we might be fully justified in believing AI all the time. So, given that, is there room to think about potential trade-offs? Is credulity really the biggest concern when there might be other benefits that we might, if we could trade off a future society that is slightly more credulous but gets to enjoy some more benefits from AI, is that a better society than a society that is less credulous but enjoys none of the benefits of AI?
Okay, there's a lot there. There's a lot on the table. Thank you. Let me try. So first of all, when you think of Clifford as having a deontological view, I mean by deontology we mean a view about duties, right? And the duty of inquiry sounds like it's deontological in some ways, right? That you have this duty to inquire. It is unconditional. It is something that might even kind of harmonize with your rational autonomy. Let me say, however, without getting into the nuanced scholarly conversation, that Clifford at one point says that, look, if you want to have an ethics, you have to form a society, and hypothetically you form that society on the basis of trust, on the basis of caring for one another, and that those duties that you have are not to the individual but to the community. And he actually says at one point that ethical wrongdoing has to do when you or I act in a kind of self-interested, selfish capacity and don't do things for the community. So if you're a baker, you're going to bake bread and you're not going to cut corners, you're not going to poison the bread, you're not going to put sawdust in it or whatever else. If you're a ship owner, you're going to be mindful of that ship, take care of it, make the necessary repairs and inspections, but this is all towards this community. But what Clifford hinges us on is like, if we want to live together in this harmonious way, we had better follow these duties, and the duty of inquiry being one of them. Now, I know duty sounds like it's deontological, it taps into that, but he doesn't think so. He also goes against Kant's categorical imperative, and I won't get into the argument there, but he denies that he's offering something like Kant's categorical imperative. So you're wondering if there are benefits of credulity that Clifford doesn't discuss. Now, part of it, again, when Clifford, what he means by credulity is that habitual openness to believing things on these unworthy reasons. But he also thinks that it's kind of self-serving, and that a credulous person is going to believe what they want. You know, they're even going to believe the kind of myths and miracles that Clifford worries about, because he thinks, well, if you're willing to believe those things, right, you have a really kind of diminished sense of inquiry here if you haven't ruled out those doubts and questions that a reasonable person would have about these. He also links credulity, though, to a kind of readiness to deceive one another, and thinks that the credulous person, or credulous character, which I think alerts us to something interesting here on his view of ethics. The credulous character is, you know, in this kind of family with the murderer and the thief and all these other criminals who are willing to betray their community for, again, selfish reasons. They're willing to injure others when they're in a private capacity, and Clifford thinks that this is sort of dead wrong, especially when they have these duties. The duties, again, are to the community. And so, if that's happening, it looks like credulity really is kind of this rottenness, and the rottenness can spread. And I don't view him as a utilitarian or a consequentialist. I neither view him as a deontologist, but I think he's arguing for a character-based ethics. Sometimes we call these the virtues of character, virtue ethics. And I see the virtuous person as this kind of citizen, he thinks, who will kind of take care of those duties and make sure to live up to them, including the duty of inquiry, and won't do it for selfish reasons, but they're willing to do things for the sake of the community, as these kind of citizens. And that is then contrasted with the credulous character, right? And so we've got these different characters and a whole range of shades in between. And so you and I and others, and Clifford's going to say it's not just the philosopher, the statesman or the poet who has this universal duty to live up to inquiry, right? And to make sure that we rule out our questions and doubts and all of those things that reasonably need to be tested. But it's also the person who's quaffing a pint in the tavern, right? The person who's at the ale house, or, the mother who stays home and attends to her kids and everything else. Like, he's willing to say everyone in society has this duty. Now, that puts a lot of weight on all of us, but it's about responsible belief. Now, when you ask about the benefits of credulity, I think Clifford would worry because, again, he's connecting it to this kind of character, right? Where it's not just about actions. It's about someone repeating these kinds of actions and then having these go into practice. And so at one point in the second section, you'll notice, he says that sometimes we have to act on probabilities, right? And we have to do so to test hypotheses, to collect better evidence that would then help us inquire better, right? And, there's a difference between that and believing. Belief and action are different, although Clifford says that when you believe something, right, it's going to lead you to a tendency to act. That doesn't mean, however, that everything he says about the norms of belief cover everything of the norms of actions, right? Certain actions we have to undertake on a probabilistic basis because, again, they help us understand things better. So that might actually lend itself to the kind of cases you have in mind, when it comes to some of these AI technologies that we don't understand, and we had to act on them. But we should be very, very careful about the beliefs we form, because if we start to believe those things, we shut down our minds about them, and then can lead to this kind of descent towards credulity, right, by breaking away or eroding this duty of inquiry.
I think my biggest concern about Clifford is that he's being a bit simplistic in terms of the way we understand the pragmatics of belief sometimes. So let me ask you a specific question relating to the use of algorithms used to detect whether something has been AI generated or not. So these are services that are often used in academics to determine, for example, if a student has submitted a paper, is it generative AI written or not? And these algorithms are generally fairly reliable. However, they're known to have a 2% error rate. In other words, in 2% of cases, they'll falsely accuse a student of cheating. So, on the one hand, we might have a number of doubts about these algorithms. We might have concerns about what they're looking for, how accurate they actually are, and what we're supposed to do if we have doubts about the veracity of these algorithms, right? However, it may be the case that we're not always able to follow up reasonably on all these doubts, particularly since, AI, we're talking about things that operate at scale, right? So we're not talking about individual inquirers following up on their individual doubts about these algorithms separately. We're talking about a kind of collective action problem where, on the one hand, yes, there may be some doubts about the veracity of these algorithms, but on the other hand, they seem like most of the time they get it right. And if you didn't have that tool, if you weren't ready to form a belief on the basis of that tool, then we would basically have no tool to determine if something is AI generated or not, right? And in that case, wouldn't we end up in a far worse situation where potentially people can, submit things to in academia that might not be written by them, and we'd have no way of telling. So in some cases, is it better to go with a system that we actually might have a lot more doubts about, that we may not be able to follow up at all on, compared to a system where we don't rely on that, but academia as we know it might fall apart?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, these are difficult questions. So, for example, I would worry in those cases what I'm believing, why I'm believing it, whether or not, again, there are standing doubts and questions, but also you said we trust one another. So Clifford isn't naive here. He thinks that there are expert authorities and that people can help us, understand these technologies better. They can give you a sense of, okay, there's a 2% error rate, and how to maybe make sure that you don't accuse the student on these false grounds when that would be, unfounded, or there's room for suspicion that the student didn't, use this to cheat. Now, again, Clifford really stresses this point about a kind of trust in society, maybe naively so at times, right? He thinks that if we want to live together in this harmonious society, we'd better, have some trust. But trust has its limits and it has to be earned. And he thinks, if you're going to trust someone else, are they being honest? That's one question. Do they know what they're talking about? That's another. Do they make good judgments? So, oftentimes we look to these expert authorities for help in navigating any of these decisions, right? And I mean, when it comes to particular cases, I might be very reluctant to accuse a student if I have real doubts about it and think that the error rate might be, something worth considering. And I don't want to unfairly accuse them, especially not believe that they're a cheater, because once I do that, again, I suffer from shutting down my mind about the matter, making it up about, this case, and then thinking of the student maybe as a cheater and looking for evidence of that. I'm not sure this gives any sort of neat and tidy solution to the questions that you have, but it at least, tries to get at some of maybe those central issues when it comes to trust and not a kind of naive trust. But I don't know if credulity would be the right term, because Clifford uses it in quite kind of specialized way.
I think one of the interesting questions is the moral judgment, the value of credulity as a potential moral and epistemic concern versus all the other things that we're worried about, right? Because you mentioned, trust has, it's hard, but it's also costly. It's very expensive, right? And so, or it can be. And so, I suppose, it's kind of interesting contrasting Clifford's idea about, how we should all be sort of good inquirers in a lot of cases, but there might be cases where that's not always possible or may not always be desirable either.
So what do you think about deception? Some people would say, wouldn't it be nice to kind of live in a blissful ignorance and be kind of self-deceived and soothed by, I believe in miracles and, I believe in an afterlife and whatever else. I mean, what do you think about the nature of even like self-deception? Is it something that's worthy and beneficial in some cases, or would you really worry that it makes someone credulous and maybe even willing to believe just what they want to believe, and that could harm successive generations because those successive generations in some ways inherit the beliefs that we have?
So this is interesting because we earlier we had referenced whether we should understand Clifford as a deontologist or not, but in some ways he is making a consequentialist. There's a consequentialist argument to be made that we have these duties of inquiry, we have these obligations to follow up on our doubts because future generations and the future of humanity are all tied up with these issues, right? Which is a fair enough reason to be concerned, right? But think about it. If you could have a future potentially where, the concern is always that if you're credulous, right, that you might believe things and things would go badly for you. I think, right? But if we were all, if we could imagine an AI future where AI more or less makes most of the decisions for us, it runs the economy okay, it tells us what to do, and we become entirely credulous to these things, but we're all happy for it, is that such a horrible thing, right?
Well, let's maybe go back to some of those considerations we had about happiness, the good life, quality of life. John Stuart Mill at one time says that it would be better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a pig or a cattle or a cow or something satisfied, right? That it would be unbefitting of a human life to be so much woefully ignorant and live that sort of unexamined life. And Clifford would think, as far as I understand him, that it kind of would be undignified to be entirely credulous about these things. It would be like a naive child in certain ways, but worse. Remember that someone who has a delusion is divorced from reality in their thinking, right? I mean, the person who thinks that the government is always watching them, or that the people at the bus stop are ready to pounce and steal their money. They're living these kind of paranoid, delusional thoughts. But the thing about delusion is that when one's under it, one doesn't know that one's under a delusion. Right? The same way if you're entirely credulous, I don't think you know you're entirely credulous. And there's something to be said about how that wouldn't be a kind of worthy human existence, right? So unexamined. And again, Clifford here's thinking that the sort of credulous character that one would form, again, allows someone to believe in self-serving things, what they want to believe, and maybe even, steal and lie and cheat, and just have a disregard for others in certain ways. I mean, I try to tell my students, at the beginning of the year, that maybe you'll be able to get away with cheating. You might be able to, right? You might be able to use sophisticated AI-powered technology to do this, right? And have a chatbot like ChatGPT be able to fulfill this. But the thought that they have is maybe this is a one-off. And sometimes they get really stressed out and tired and say, oh, I'm just going to do this one time. But of course, once you perform it once, you start to break down that guardrail. It starts to budge a bit. Then you say, maybe I'll do it a second time, right? A pattern of these performances or repeat actions can lead to a kind of habit. And then all of a sudden you're the thief or kind of monster you never wanted to be in the first place. And, that's the kind of thought I try to instill in them. It might be a bit too lofty and, have all this kind of nobility attached to it. Like I will tell them, well, what if I gave you a ring that would make you invisible, right? Would you do the same sorts of things you're doing now, or would you lie, cheat, and steal and, do all these other things? And it's a bit of a test of character, the old, thought exercise of the Ring of Gyges in Plato's Republic. And a test of character is, I think, what Clifford has in mind here. I'm pretty convinced that he's a character-based, has a character-based ethics, an arete ethics, as we would call it, or virtue ethics. I'm fairly convinced that that's there in his work.
Can I, given that a lot of Clifford's ethical argument seems to be about the idea of our duties to the community, right? And we've talked about this idea of future generations, right? But here's a question for Clifford, right? Who's Clifford to tell future generations what's good or bad for them? Right? I mean, he's making these kind of universal assumptions about what's good for future generations. But what if future generations say, hey, we've got our AI algorithms and we're doing just fine?
Yeah, he had would probably ground this in some careful considerations about history and how history tends to repeat itself, right? And not to be too somber and grim about it, but the historian's view is that history tends to repeat itself, and the sort of characters, the same cast of characters are recycled. The character's fate, as the Greeks used to say, but also, there's a placard at Auschwitz, and again, not to be too somber, but it basically says those who are ignorant of history are condemned to relive its mistakes, right? And so, Clifford's probably going to say, well, what do we owe for future generations? To make sure that they don't have really, really bad beliefs that they inherit from their ancestors, right? Who might believe in all sorts of wild things. I mean, it's not too long ago that this was an age of superstition. Maybe we're still in it, by the way. I don't want to get too cynical on this podcast, but it wasn't long ago that people thought that the stars align in a certain pattern and cause disasters, or that salamanders are generated from fire, or even an example that I like, that malaria was caused by miasmas or evil vapors, right, instead of being transmitted by mosquitoes. That diseases were caused by spirits. There's an interesting case about belief that has to do with, in the United States, about power lines and cancer. Are you familiar with this? Do you know?
I've heard of it, yeah.
Right? And people thought, well, the power lines are causing cancer because there's such a high incidence of people living near power lines having cancer. The explanation was that in the United States, many people who live near power lines are poor. Many people who are poor don't have health insurance. They don't get routine screenings or checkups. And therefore, there's likely to be unchecked cancer and, this high incidence of it. Compound that with maybe a bad diet and bad lifestyle choices, and, but I'm told that upwards of, and you can come back to me on this, it's something like 20 billion American dollars were spent on these studies.
Wrong.
That had to do with cancer and power lines. But once people believed that, including, by the way, the investigators, they were convinced that it was the power lines. It must have been the power lines. And they started shutting down their thinking about it. You could even say, and I think reasonably, that they were a bit credulous.
So, in terms of the kinds of arguments that Clifford's made about the concerns about, humanity falling into this stage of credulity, and, if you believe things for poor reasons now, you will start to believe, all sorts of things for poor reasons, and so will everybody else. How realistic is this argument? For example, is it occasionally possible, is it likely the case, for example, that for certain kinds of beliefs you might be more credulous, whereas for other cases you just won't be credulous, and so therefore, even within a single person, credulity may not be all-encompassing? And then even when you expand that out to everyone else, how likely is it that if people are credulous in one area of thinking, again, let's say, for example, Turnitin, AI detecting algorithms kind of thing, let's say we're credulous in that one case, how likely is it going to be that we're going to be credulous in everything else that we might happen to believe?
I think that's hard to say. Part of it is, whether or not we form this habit of credulity. And as a society, aren't we going to want to subject most, if not all, of our clients to critical thinking? So let's take a ridiculous example. Some people think that chocolate milk comes from brown cow. Right? I mean, the level of credulity that takes seems to me to be, a pretty significant point here, where if certain people in society are willing to believe in that, what else are they willing to believe in? And
so you're saying
this sort of
come from brown?
I'm saying does not. And the chocolate is added to the milk, right? Which comes from the cows, which is not brown. It's not chocolate, right? We don't have these chocolate cows that are producing chocolate milk. And so I think we have to be concerned about this. That sort of level of credulity really does seem worrisome, and that critical thinking needs to have its place. And by critical thinking, Clifford is going to appeal again to this duty of inquiry, this duty of investigation. And I think you and I are on board with this. We're pretty sort of, I think, eye to eye on it, because, an inquirer's approach or inquirer's guide even to AI ethics seems to be important. I mean, if we sort of lower our standards of questioning and don't take our doubts seriously, then we could get into a real kind of problem here. And oftentimes our doubts again alert us to something we need to follow up on, we need to pursue. That, to me, is the kind of classical pragmatist bridge between our views, right? I mean, I might have a more sort of Peircean, Cliffordian angle on this, but I know you have studied Dewey and the sort of Deweyan angle. If there's a problematic situation, we do need to investigate or follow up on it. To me, this seems to me quite important, not only philosophically, but in sort of in general sort of public affairs, right? How we should engage in things as members of society. And I'm worried about the sort of credulous character, right? And again, the sort of character, I'll stress that, because it means there's a tendency then to no longer follow this duty of inquiry. and to slip into the kind of mindset that's too open to self-serving beliefs, too open to believe what we want, and then departs from reality. Reality is something I deeply care about. I know we might want to talk about Peirce. If you do, his view of reality is something that interests me continually. It's an abiding interest of mine.
So, perhaps a slightly more fun question. I'm not quite sure, right? So, the interesting thing, I think I'm not sure how often Clifford scholarship focuses on this, but I think quite often you and I have focused on this case study of the ship owner, right, as the primary example we like to focus on. But there's this other example that Clifford talks about, which is the public conspiracy and the accusations that get put forward, right? But the interesting thing is that sometimes conspiracies do exist, right? There was a video I was watching not that long ago, and it was talking about early colonial societies in North America and the way they called up people for militia service, right? And it turns out, in hindsight, looking at all the records, that there actually was a bit of a conspiracy in terms of who the families were, in terms of who they were calling up for service to the militia. It was, poorer families and none of the richer families, right? In other words, sometimes conspiracies do exist, right? And so given that, and given the fact that sometimes people will literally cover up evidence, right? Is it always such a terrible thing to believe, given that we lack evidence? Maybe it might be sometimes the case that, maybe there is license in believing something despite any evidence, because perhaps there really is a conspiracy out there, right? And so I'm thinking of, for example, you can think of television shows like The X-Files and Mulder and Scully investigating all of these conspiracies within the government and all these cover-up scenarios, right? So is it really so sinful for someone like Mulder or Scully to believe, or at least be willing to entertain things that most people would criticize them for as lacking in any evidence, because to their view, the conspiracy is real and that the evidence has been covered up?
Okay, very good. In the example you gave, someone like Mulder or Scully in the X-Files, they're going to investigate the case. They're going to follow up on their doubts and questions. And yes, there are conspiracies, and they've been, perpetrated. And I'm not saying that, we shouldn't think of those or entertain them or look into them. I absolutely think we should. Particularly, again, when those doubts or questions clue us into them. For example, it may seem outlandish to just simply propose that, there, was a massive conspiracy with, say, Jeffrey Epstein, something like this, right? If you had told me that, and that there was these rich billionaires who all went to this sort of island and they were, into all these very sort of degenerate activities, including exploiting women, having sex with them and doing so in a criminal enterprise, I would at first, be somewhat hesitant to believe that. That sounds like an extraordinary, outlandish story. But again, if we look at the evidence and we follow it up and we say, okay, does it meet our doubts and questions? Does it meet the study of inquiry? Yes, we've got to pursue those things. I wouldn't want anyone to, stop their thinking, especially if it doesn't satisfy their doubts or questions. As an inquirer, that's extremely important to me. And I'm not saying there aren't conspiracies. And, as someone who even, I'll get a bit autobiographical if you don't mind. As someone who grew up during the Gulf War invasion, Operation Desert Storm 1 and 2, the United States claimed that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction. Right? They were convinced by this, and we had certain officials testify to the United Nations and other places that Iraq indeed had these weapons of mass destruction, and then we found out that there was not evidence for that. Right? That the sort of doubts and questions that people had about these things turned out to be right, that Iraq just didn't have them. And, nonetheless, this concerns the ethics of belief because there are many people in the population who just couldn't update their beliefs afterwards. Right? They had convinced themselves that Iraq was, a very dangerous country because, again, it had these weapons. And once they believed those things, it shut down their thinking. And it didn't matter in some cases that the United States government came out and said, indeed, we were wrong. Iraq didn't have those weapons of mass destruction, and you shouldn't believe that. Beliefs are dangerous, and they're dangerous to inquiry. And if we don't take them seriously, we fall into these sort of traps. I mean, this is the point about credulity that Clifford, and I think I'm trying to stress even in this exchange with you.
So moving on, we're talking a little bit about pragmatism and our mutual interest in it, and the fact that we come from different perspectives. Ian comes from much more of a Peircean perspective. I come from a much more Deweyan perspective, although I think both you and I share an interest in all of the pragmatists, I think it's fair to say. So let me ask you this, as someone who's more of a Peircean expert, where do you see the biggest difference between Peirce and Dewey as being?
Maybe in their commitment to reality and the concept of reality. I mean, Peirce was focusing on this throughout many of his seminal papers. I mean, whether that be the fixation of belief or how to make our ideas clear. We have to remember that in How to Make Our Ideas Clear, Peirce ends with the idea of reality. And in the fixation of belief, Peirce says that the method of scientific investigation, which he takes to be the method that would eventually fix belief, commits itself to a hypothesis of reality. And by reality, he has a few things to say. If we consider, again, how to make our ideas clear, there are several gradations, and at least three. And they are one, familiarity, definition, and then this pragmatic conception where we try to understand all the conceivable consequences or possible consequences of an idea. So Peirce starts with this example. It's very simple, which is if you're trying to figure out the meaning of something, ask yourself, what would happen if you apply a certain test to it. So he takes the example of a rock, for example, and that if the rock is hard, if you were to, put a knife's edge against this hard object, there'd be some resistance. And this is just to give us an example of, what would happen. Peirce again is very much resistant to what's going on in philosophy, especially since the time of Descartes. For Descartes, inquiry was something where we would need to question all of our beliefs and find out maybe what is indubitable or as certain as possible, absolutely certain. And Peirce worries that someone like Descartes, tries to upturn all these beliefs that we have when that's not possible, but also entertains these kind of possibilities that he calls paper doubts. So one of those is like, Matt, how do you know that right now you're not being deceived by an all-powerful evil demon? And the all-powerful evil demon is creating these seamless experiences in you. And so if this all-powerful evil demon was bent on tricking you, would you know this? Now, Peirce might respond, well, look, does that capture the nature of doubt? Or is it more like a paper doubt? Right? Because I don't think this evil demon hypothesis shakes you to the core. Right? You don't have a doubt about it like you would if you had a doubt about where your keys are, or whether or not the stove's on when you leave your home, and you're wondering, this doubt really makes me nervous and it shakes me up, and it might make me nervous. The evil demon hypothesis doesn't seem to make you nervous. But also, when we're asking about evil demons and this sort of thing, wonder where does the evil demon live? Where does the evil demon go?
How does it work?
How does it work? Sure. These sorts of questions come to mind, and, they're very sort of everyday, ordinary questions, but they tell us something about the kind of nature of these doubts, that they seem kind of fabricated.
What is the diet of a demon? Do they require a lot of carbs, for their magical powers,
Right. So, these sorts of questions seem to be a bit fabricated and made up. And therefore they're kind of paper doubts. Peirce had a realist spirit that infuses this pragmatism. And he thought there's a reality to all of these things, and that scientists are really tracking that. He was worried, actually, that we get caught up in this thought of reality is simply completely independent of our minds. It transcends our minds. But then you can ask, well, wait a second. What kind of an idea of reality could you have? What would be the conceivable consequences of it? What would the meaning of it be if it were independent of all minds? And he thought, no, you really need to make it so that it is something that minds could grasp, and something that's meaningful, but something that we derive at the end of inquiry, if we were to pursue our inquiry as best we could. Now, Peirce is a logician, so he thinks that, look, there are going to be several surprises along the way. You've got to have a logic that gives you a way of explaining these surprises. You've got to have a logic that gives you a way of taking samples about the world and then maybe generalizing from those. And you've got to have a logic that would give you consistency in your thinking, namely deduction, that you could deduce certain consequences from these. The example I love to give about surprises is coelacanths. Do you know about the coelacanths? They're called living fossils. They're fish. And coelacanths were thought to be extinct since the Jurassic Age. They're these fish that live in the deep ocean. And as far as I understand it, in 1962 in South Africa, there was a dead floating coelacanth on the surface of the ocean. And of course, if you can identify a coelacanth and know what it is, you'd say, wait a second, what in the world is this? We thought they were extinct for millions of years. Well, this would be a huge surprise. But, Peirce would call this a kind of abduction that you do, that if you saw a dead coelacanth on the surface of the ocean, you would think that, well, maybe there are living fish or coelacanths at the bottom of the ocean. And indeed, they found us out that, yes, these fish are alive, these living consoles. This is a nice example of the kind of logical science that Peirce is trying to pursue with abduction. But again, he's always trying to track reality. And reality for philosophers, of course, is sometimes a mystifying concept, right? We talk about metaphysics as a study of reality. Now, Peirce is going to try to get into metaphysics through logical considerations, through inquiry. So, if you think about what reality is, what we mean by it, and again, it's about the meaning of reality that counts. We might start with familiarity. You have young nieces or nephews, right? Have you ever asked them what they understand by reality or what reality is?
I don't think they'd have the patience for a question like that.
So, the thing is, like, even if, my niece and nephew, Henry and Fiona, they're about 7 and 10 respectively, they will talk about Harry Potter. I don't know a lot about Harry Potter. I know there's a Hogwarts academy, right, where they learn about wizards and things like this. But, for them, this is an engagement in make-believe. They know it's play. They know it's imagination. It's not reality. And so there's some familiar difference here between, what is make-believe on the one hand and what is reality on the other, right? What's Harry Potter on the one hand and what's, you had to come to dinner and eat your peas and chicken or whatever it is that they have for dinner.
You saying Peirce is a fiction voice?
No, I'm saying he's a realist. And so he's got a sense of what is familiar when it comes to reality. And reality is not simply dependent on my mind or your mind or anyone's in particular. I mean, if I talk about, for example, the dream I had last night, I sometimes have these dreams of centaurs, which are, beings where it's half man, half horse. Very strange dreams. I won't get into it. We don't need to. However, that dream depends on my point, right, for what it is. And you'd say it's real that I'm dreaming. But what the dream is of is not real, right? What that was about was a kind of fiction. It depended on my mind. I think even children understand this. They have this kind of level of familiarity. Now, Peirce will go on to say, well, the definition of reality is what is independent of your mind, my mind, or anyone's mind in particular. And yeah, there's something to be said about that. And then this kind of third grade of clearness that he talks about, where if you were to test as far as you could in the indefinite long run, whatever it is that you have in mind, then eventually if you were to really reach a belief, then he would say, okay, is it unassailable from doubt? Is it unassailable in the way that it's met all the sort of conditions of inquiry that it needs? Then yeah, it is something that is real. And for Peirce, this is hugely important, and it kind of really defines and is distinctive of his pragmatism or pragmatism. I mean, we can go into that if we want. But I think this is something that really does distinguish his view in many ways and shows that central commitment. And I wonder if it's there for Dewey, and so I'll pass this question on to you, of whether Dewey makes a kind of commitment to reality in the way that Peirce does, and how that tracks inquiry.
So, I think in some ways Dewey is a realist, although I think he'll be very qualified about how he'll use that term. I definitely, Dewey will definitely deny the idea of the noumenal idea of reality, the thing in itself. For Dewey, it always depends. For Dewey, it always depends upon the question being asked to some extent. So, for example, let's take, for example, the question about, is Pluto a planet? Is it a planet, or is it a dwarf planet? And of course, the question about, how we define whether something is a planet or a dwarf planet is not based on reality itself. It's based on our own interest in how we categorize and organize, outer space in such a way that allows us to sort of make the best sense of things, right? A planet is such that it, has such a mass that allows it to expand past the orbit of another, orbital body, right? And so therefore, on that basis, something qualifies as a planet, and if Pluto doesn't quite meet that technical standard, therefore it isn't technically a planet, it's a dwarf planet, right? So I think Dewey's point is that Dewey is a realist in the sense that he's not looking for facts that are based on purely what we want the world to be like, but rather he's very much interested in what will allow for the kind of successful interaction between an organism and its environment. But sometimes the answer in terms of how we explain or define reality will depend upon the question we have about it. If we're less interested, for example, in how in whether something has the right kind of mass to allow it to exceed a certain orbital pathway, we might be less interested in whether something is a dwarf planet or a planet, so to speak. It's only because we have that kind of interest that we define and describe the world in such a way. And so Dewey is very much a realist, I think, in the sense that he wants to allow for a realism that will allow us to successfully interact with the world, because he definitely thinks that experience is not something that we just sort of make up. We can't just sort of produce whatever experience we want or wish based on whatever feelings we have. It depends on what we actually do. And sometimes, whether we are successful or not in terms of what we want to do, does depend on what we're actually interested in accomplishing in the first place. And so Dewey's a realist, but he's also going to make some room for the idea of what we're trying to accomplish in terms of how we describe and define humanity. So I don't know if necessarily this makes him a divergent from Peirce, but he would definitely deny the noumenal conception of reality.
Oh, so does Peirce. I mean, this comes down to Peirce doesn't think that the thing in itself that could be taken apart or at some distance from any of the tests that we give it could make that much sense. So some people think that reality would just be like whatever transcends the mind and whatever exists at this moment. But, I mean, Peirce would definitely worry about whether or not that could be meaningful. He talks about this, and I don't want to introduce too much terminology, but nominalism, right? And so one of the central threats in Peirce's eyes is that we're too nominalistic. We think that beings exist as individual things and that exhausts reality, that whatever exists is what is real. But Peirce will respond, no, there are some things that are general, that are real. And so when Peirce talks about realism, he thinks that this is a commitment to new kind of scholastic realism, where scholastic realism is a thesis about the reality of general beings. So now this sounds spooky, but let me.
Can I ask you a question real quick then?
Of course.
So does that mean, right? Are dwarf planets a thing? Are they genuinely a real thing as distinct from real planets?
I don't know enough about astronomy to answer this.
Well, like, let me just somewhat clarify in the sense that, like, the way they often it's very much a pragmatic distinction, right? It's if a planet exceeds a certain mass and allows it to achieve a certain kind of orbital pathway in a certain such a way, it'll be qualified as a planet, and if otherwise, it'll be qualified as a dwarf planet, right?
Okay.
But does that mean that we should take the concept of dwarf planet as being a genuinely real concept, independent of human interest?
Okay. I don't know. I don't know. I'm sorry. Probably.
Because I think tying back somewhat is the question of the relationship between Peirce and Dewey, right? Whereas for Dewey's going to say that certain general concepts, how we, carve up the world to some extent, will depend upon our values, like what we're interested in, right? Like if we have an interest in carving up the world in such a way that we say, okay, this is a planet and this is a dwarf planet, right? Then the literal truth of whether Pluto is a dwarf planet will depend upon our interest as much as the way the world is independent of whether we were here or not, right? And so I think the question is that something that Peirce would consider to be abominable, or would he be completely comfortable with that?
So one of the things that should be said in his favor, especially when it comes to arguing for the realism that we've talked about, which is that, these general beings are real, independent of you, I, or anyone in particular, is that there seem to be scientific laws that the world is obeying. And that has to be something that figures into our understanding of reality. The kind of pedestrian example that Peirce gives is, look, if I were to drop this pen at a certain height, it will, without anything impeding it, fall to the ground or the table or anything else, right? I mean, it's a very kind of simple example. But the question then becomes, well, is the law of gravitation there exhausted by any of its instances? How many times we do it? And Peirce will say no, that there's a real habit that, this one object has, and the reality of that is not exhausted by particular instances, and it's rather a kind of generality. And it's that, indeed, that objects in general will, fall to the ground if they're not interfered or impeded by anything else that stops them from doing that. And therefore, you've got an understanding of a law, a scientific law. And if that scientific law is general and a part of reality, then we must admit, as realists, that generality is real. I think that kind of encapsulates Peirce's argument for realism.
Sure. So I mean, I don't think that Dewey would disagree, in the sense that I think that he would claim that anything that we reliably find, holds true of our predictions is real, right? But again, guarding against that noumenal conception of reality, of describing reality as it is, independent of any of our interests, right? He's going to say that, we might describe, again, going back to this question of planets, right? Is Pluto a dwarf planet, right? Is that true, right? Technically, right, like to some extent, it depends, the literal truth of that statement depends on whether we think it's a meaningful distinction between whether, whether it's a meaningful distinction between the mass of bodies and the way they orbit around planets and in terms of their orbital pathways, that's a distinction that we consider to be meaningful, right? And so I don't necessarily think the point is that, Dewey's not going to make the claim that reality depends upon human minds, but knowledge is not just about copying reality. It's about allowing us to navigate reality in such a way that it will allow us to be further successful in whatever we want to be, in terms of how you might want to navigate reality. And so in that case, it might make sense to say Pluto is a dwarf planet and all these other planets are not dwarf planets, right? Because it allows us to understand perhaps the nature of mass or something like that. And it's not a kind of distinction that might carve nature at its joints in some abstract way that would be like not understandable to, or would have to be understandable to some abstract mind rather than a universal thought, right? Perhaps another way of understanding this is that I know that there are some Peirceans out there who believe in the idea of transhumanism. In other words, that like we can only really understand reality if we can transcend our own human limitations, rather than the idea that reality, and in terms of how we understand it and define it and describe it, should be in human terms to some extent, because knowledge is supposed to work for us rather than the other way around.
So, one thing to say here is that we want to be very careful about real and verbal differences. And Peirce, I think, was quite careful about this. So, for example, I give this case to my students sometimes. let's say we want to make hummus. You summon the store for some garbanzo beans. You say, pick me up 2 cans of garbanzo beans. I don't know what garbanzo beans mean. But if I know that they're chickpeas, and that the verbal difference here is garbanzo beans and chickpeas, then, I can pick up the garbanzo beans or chickpeas, and we can make hummus. It'll be great. Alright, we'll enjoy this. But we don't want to confuse the sort of verbal differences and the real differences. This happens in philosophy routinely, as you know. People get confused about a description, right? And they start to wonder, okay, is that description the same as the one I'm giving? I mean, chickpeas and garbanzo beans is a very kind of almost silly example, but it gives you a sense of like what's going on there. And what the pragmatist cares about is, no, it really depends on the sort of reality here. If chickpeas and garbanzo beans are the same when it comes to reality and the difference is merely verbal, then we shouldn't really care about that. And we can test it out by figuring, are all the conceivable differences the same? And if they are, then let's not worry about it, right? If Marshall Mathers is Eminem and Eminem is Marshall Mathers or Slim Shady, then, let's not get so caught up on these names.
Sure, but again, there, is there this concern that we might be missing out on some ultimate reality because we're not the transhumanists? We're asking the right questions about who Eminem really is.
The sort of ultimate reality here, I think, has to be sort of run through inquiry and An Inquirer's views when they lead you to the same sort of things, right?
Well, in that way, I see, it's funny because I think I don't necessarily think that Dewey and Peirce are always that far apart. Sometimes it's hard to tell.
Good.
Just to me, sometimes he seems a bit more metaphysical, but oftentimes they do seem to be on the same page in the sense that, personally, my own reading of Peirce isn't necessarily that he has to take this transhumanist idea that, like, we have to ask questions from the ultimate standard of, like, what we could possibly know and experience, but rather more what we're interested in. And so, therefore, how we define reality will, to some extent depend upon how we act and how we interact with the world. It's not just defining the nature of the world from the perspective of nobody.
So one of the things that really appeals to me, as far as René Descartes and Charles Peirce and even maybe John Dewey go, is that if you were to take them seriously and you were seriously think through their thoughts, would it convince you at the end of it? And, Descartes thought that, for example, you've got to try to question all of these beliefs that you have and subject them to doubt. As far as possible, this doubt will go. And even think about an all-powerful evil demon, or whether or not you're dreaming right now. And the point there was, again, it matters for you or I or whoever is pursuing that inquiry, whether or not we're going to be convinced by it. I found that really appealing, in many ways. So, if you're a scientist or a mathematician and you're trying to instill these lessons to young students, get them so that they will be able to appreciate these things from their first person perspective, right? And to conduct the experiments and to be convinced by them and to try to keep going with that. I mean, we're in such a specialized time where we can't do it completely, maybe, but I think it does follow this duty of inquiry or path of inquiry that matters philosophically and personally. And those are the sort of thinkers that I find to resonate with my mind and maybe with ours too. I mean, inquiry and reality are two of the concepts that I think philosophically are mattering to my mind most, at least at present.
Okay, well, this has been another episode of the Reconstructing Philosophy podcast. My guest today was Dr. Ian MacDonald from the University of Waterloo. Ian, I want to thank you for being here and talking to me about Clifford and his views on evidentialism and the ethics of belief.
Thanks very much for having me on. It's been excellent.
If you want to hear more about Ian's thoughts about AI, feel free to look at them in our new book, An Inquirer's Guide to Ethics in AI from Broadview Press. Once more, I want to thank Ian for joining me today, and I want to thank all of you for listening at home as well. This has been another episode of the Reconstructing Philosophy podcast. Until next time. All right, bye-bye.
Yahoo, Billy! Billy's number one! Yahoo!